All right. Well, thank you guys so much for inviting me. It's a huge honor to be able to speak to you guys today. I am going to talk a little bit about quality engineering in the future. Actually, I'm going to sneak in another little topic too. I'm also going to talk about like what might quality engineering and strategic foresight have in combo, like where's the overlap here? And I'm doing this partly because this, we always heard this, story about like you shouldn't give people the fish, you should teach them how to fish, right? And there's actually some very interesting commonalities that you might, we can't predict the future. And if you came to me today because you want me to tell you what's going to happen in 10 years, I'm very sorry to disappoint you. But maybe I can help you utilize that excellent brain you already have, because you need to have that when you're in quality engineering, and see how you can use some of those mindsets together with strategic foresight, so you can think about your future of this role in a meaningful way. So we're going to look at, before we get to the future of quality engineering, we're going to look at briefly look at the intersection between quality engineering and strategic foresight. And you told me that you guys have already had some breakout rooms and talked about trends. That's excellent, because we're going to talk a little bit about trends in a little bit, and then we can kind of compare notes. All right. So who am I to come here and talk about these things? So I have a little bit of a different background. I came out of social science. I'm originally from Norway, so I got my undergrads in Oslo, Norway, at the University of Oslo. And then I studied strategic foresight. I got my master's degree in strategic foresight at the University of Houston. And then I continued with more graduate education in data analytics at Penn State University. So like I like to think of it, usually people who call themselves futurists, they typically have, maybe maybe a degree in engineering or software development or something like that. And then they kind of like think about the future, but they don't have a degree in it. In my case, it was the other way around. I actually started with a degree in, it actually says in my diploma that I'm a futurist. And then I'm actually working in engineering. So the type of quality engineering that I'm doing might be a little bit different, but it is my title. And I can't go into, depths with what I do, obviously, but that's not interesting to you guys anyway. But I can't talk about it for confidentiality reasons, and I'm sure you guys are aware of that. But what we're going to talk about in general is more like quality and quality assurance, quality engineering in a more general sense. So what does it have in common? What do these two fields have in common? And I think that one place to start is that we are optimizing processes for desired outcomes. So both quality engineering and strategic foresight aim to optimize for processes. Like we aim to look at how can we make a better future, how can we look at what we're doing today and improve our methods so that the future it works, whatever it is that we work in, that looks better. So the way that we do it in strategic foresight is that we in strategic foresight, we use different scenario methods and we explore multiple different types of future narratives. In quality engineering, we're using testing and sort of loss analysis, and we try to kind of bridge that gap between the unwanted future and the desired future by kind of closing that gap and using those type of metrics. And so both of these two fields are looking at root causes to try to understand where we're going. Now, obviously, most jobs, most professions need to at some point look at the root causes for what they're dealing with. If you're a doctor, you should at least, try to find a diagnosis before you prescribe a medicine. But I think that we take it a little bit further because we're looking at the root causes and then we're kind of looking at the causal dynamics. We don't want to go in and do a one-point fix, right? We want to really understand the patterns and do some data analysis to understand, like, what is that gap? If something isn't working today, what is the pattern of those things that aren't working and how can we make it work in the future? And in order to do so in strategic foresight, we like to talk about something we call steep analysis. And we're using this to discover trends, weak signals, and disruptive events. Now, when you work in engineering or in data science, you typically look in a very basic, or not a basic, sometimes very, very complicated, but you look into, you kind of know which data repositories you're looking into. You know what kind of instruments you're using. You kind of know what to look for. You already have kind of like confines around where those errors and those losses are going to happen. Not so in strategic foresight. What you have to do is, the first thing you get comfortable with is that you're operating in a very complex system where what is disrupting the status quo today could actually originate somewhere very, very in a very different place. So, for example, so we talk about steep. So we call it like, things and changes that are happening in the social sphere, technological sphere, environmental sphere, economic sphere, or political sphere, or any sort of like domain that you can ascribe to it. And like, for example, 2 years ago, we had something that had cascading effects on our society, but which was caused by a virus. I mean, which caused a pandemic, and the resulting effect, the kind of secondary effects from that were felt in so many different areas. We certainly felt it in the technology industry. I work for a tech company, and we were kind of one of the few industries that could very easily pivot and start working from home. Now, so in my case, my work life wasn't very disrupted. I was also working with a huge consulting project at the moment as well, because interestingly enough, to understand the future of what the pandemic did to a certain user group. But this was like easy for us to maybe navigate. And then what happened is that now there's an expectations to, and now there's a growing expectation to want to work from home. So that was kind of like some of the permanent effects that we saw from a virus. Like, who would have connected a virus to a completely new work structure? We also saw it in other areas, like in supply systems, in delivery, and all kind of things. Now, all of a sudden, it became more common to order food delivery to our homes. There's a lot of things that took effect. My daughter is in horseback riding, and interestingly enough, they saw an uptick, while most sports kind of came to a grinding halt because you couldn't group a lot of people together in the same room anymore because of a contagion. Actually, horseback riding was one of those sports that you could continue because you are outdoors all the time, and naturally you have at least 6-foot animal between you and the other person. So that was kind of interesting. And speaking of that, we also know that that was very good for my daughter and for mental health. We saw that mental health took a toll. Main thing is that one little change somewhere in the system can actually cause something that might have impact on the way you measure quality in the future, and what you measure, and the volume of quality issues that you might have to deal with in the future. And so it kind of helps having that 360 view. Now today, I guess I don't know if anybody here would want to try to guess what is the big disruptor today. I think we can see it, maybe say that generative AI is kind of that right now. And I think that a lot of people are kind of a little bit worried, like, what's that going to lead to? How does that impact my job? How does it impact safety. Like there's a lot of things that a lot of new things that arise to the surface when we have something that is disrupting it. We typically in Foresight like to talk about future as a cone. Actually, we don't even talk about the future, we talk about futures. And that is again because we can't predict the future. So the best option that we have now is to think about it in terms of different scenarios where typically we're going to talk about first the probable future. Now, I think I would say that most planners, most strategic planners, maybe as many as 90% of them spend most of their time there. The probable future. What is a probable future? It's essentially a future that is the slightly moderated version of today. Now, the problem with that, if you were to take a little time travel and you went back, let's say you went back to your childhood, or even longer, your parents' childhood, and now you got a preview into what's going to happen, this many decades into the future. Would that look like a probable future, where we are now? I don't think so. I think there's a lot of things that have changed along the way that did not seem very probable that long time ago. So that's why we also want to explore, other futures, plausible futures, possible futures. And, the longer you go, the more uncertain and the more different the future is going to look. And then we even have the preposterous future. That is the that's really science fiction. That's science fiction beyond, what you expect from the result or from the narrative. And I don't even think that you necessarily would see that in the movie theaters or read about it in the book, because most storylines are kind of created in a sense that the user can have in some sort of idea what's going to happen next, because otherwise they will just be completely lost in the bizarreness of it all. So, but we want to create all of these different narratives, and we call them scenarios. And obviously, the further in, the more preposterous. There's one more future I didn't add here, but I think it's important to talk about it, and that's the preferable future. And that's really sort of the future that you want to aim for, where you could say to yourself, if I really could have it any way I want it, if I could have like the exact type of future that I would want, what does it look like? If my organization was, clicking on all cylinders and we were able to pick our own future, what does it look like? Now what we could use is a technique called backcasting. So what you would do is essentially look at, first of all, you flesh out the scenario, you look at what it looks like, or you look at what it, you kind of unpack that onion, and now you have to logically go back in order to try to find out what are the action items that you need to do today in order to reach that in the future. Kind of that North Star, that aspirational future. And of course, you're not ever going to reach it because it's impossible. We're never ever going to be in a situation where everything is exactly how we want it. So if we were to talk a little bit about quality engineering and what the future of quality engineering looks like from that perspective, how can we do that? And I am not now going to go into like a full-blown like scenario session, because that would be impossible. Typically, when I've been working with clients in the past doing these things, we have spent, I would say, maybe the first 3 months just doing what we call environmental scanning. And that is exactly looking for, these kind of emerging trends and weak signals that happens, socially, technologically, environmentally, in all of these areas. Actually, what we also like to do is to invite our clients with us in that process, because having sort of like skin in the game in the process creates a lot more buy-in with the client. So we want our clients to be with us on the whole process. Then typically what happens is that it culminates in like some sort of scenario workshop. Might be like a 2-day, maybe even 3 days sometimes. where, you invite C-level, different, actually, ideally, anybody in the different parts of the organization. And then you basically have like these scenario crafting sessions where you talk about these different trends that you now have looked at. You looked at all of these, what we call scan hits, which are like signs that those trends that you thought were happening are indeed happening. And then you collect this, and you can really work this into like a data analytics system, and even put them in sort of like a vector space and kind of look at how they relate to one another. Obviously, we're not going to do that today. So I wanted to talk about some of the trends that I have seen, and which I think might have an effect on this type of work. And then, since you guys have had a breakout session and talked about the different trends, I would love to see if we can kind of regroup and discuss afterwards, and kind of say, like, what do you guys think? So if we were to start with social trends, I would highlight a few trends here, what I see. So I do think that demographic change will have an effect on this type of work. Some of that obviously has to do with recruiting. We have a huge, baby boomer generation that is, if they haven't already retired, they're very close to retiring. And there's actually been a huge narrowing of the generation that is starting very soon to get into the workforce. So you saw this kind of like you had a little bit of a baby boom on the beginning of this century, which sharply dropped after around 2007-ish, around that time. And that was actually mainly because it was a combination of actually reduced birth rate and also reduced immigration rate. And this is actually slowly, we're slowly getting fewer and fewer people. Obviously, that's going to have, like I mentioned, recruiting, and also on the user end as well. The fact that we have a aging population means that there will be different demands on quality. You will have to account for a larger user groups that are going to have reduced sensory functions. And so how you work that into your product, like what you need to account for at this point. I don't know what kind of industry you're in, but whatever industry you're in, your user group is going to need more guardrails and help. So there is a good opportunity there. We've seen accelerated user adoption rates. I'm sure most of you guys have seen the different type of memes around that came out right after ChatGPT came out, where it says that, when Facebook, the time it took for Facebook to reach 1 million user was like 10 months or something. ChatGPT, 5 days, right? And as we have accelerated user adoption, we can also kind of expect an accelerated hype cycle. And for those of you who are not familiar with a hype cycle, Gartner's hype cycle is a way to figure out how quickly does a new technology ramp up to become, the new big thing that everybody's talking about, only to kind of, and where everybody has huge expectations and they think that this is the new big thing and this is it. And then only to drop significantly through what we call the through of disillusionment, because now people had like these rose-colored glasses and they thought that this was going to be it. And then it drops and they're like, oh, this is nothing, never ever going to get anything out of this technology. And then it kind of stabilizes in the middle somewhere, where there are actually sustainable use cases that this technology is actually giving us. May I even mention, generative AI again? Are we maybe at the top of the hype cycle? Could it be that, in a few months, people are tired of creating pictures on Midjourney and they're tired of creating all of these funny prompts into ChatGPT or all of the different large language models, because now there's something else? Yeah, I think so. I think that's going to happen. And I think at some point we're actually might see more sort of industrial level use cases, or professional use cases of these type of technologies. That might be a good time for quality engineers to think more, systemically about how you utilize those type of technologies into your work, or maybe it is now. I would just kind of warn you that just because the public's amazement of this technology might at some point reach a big drop, it doesn't mean like the technology itself goes away or that everything is, useless at this point. We also see, increased user expectations. This again kind of goes back to maybe generational change and the fact that, users and producers tend to have much more sort of a interactive relationship than it used to be. People expect more sort of conversational interfaces with anything they use. They expect things to be more ethical. So in the past, we're way beyond that time where a business could just like, we're not going to tell you how we make the sausage, but here's a glossy ad, and now you can pretend that you kind of take part of this like fancy group of people. We're way beyond that. People want to know everything about how you're making your product, how you treat your workers and all of that. They want transparency. And guess what? Quality engineering comes in there as well, because we are the ones that are providing quality. We are the ones that provide assurance to the user. So it's playing a huge part in that. People want personalized user interfaces. And again, there's an opportunity there as well to make sure that, the quality is reflected in how quickly an algorithm can adapt to a specific user. Technological trends, well, we already talked about it. So we know that there are huge leaps and bounds in machine learning and AI happening at the moment. I think what is particularly interesting is like when the hype dies down a little bit, like what remains, what is here to stay. I think maybe one of those things could be like when it starts, fusing with other types of technology, when we kind of see like AI combined with 3D printing and additive manufacturing, like it reaches that industrial grade type of usefulness, and it can actually be used in production, and it can create higher quality products and services than we have today. Combining this with IoT networks and smart sensors that requires both maintenance and a lot of QA in it. As we're becoming more technological, yes, there are technologies that might replace some of our jobs, absolutely, at least some of our job functions. But as we get more technology, there's going to be ever more requests for people who can kind of make sure that the system works. So again, I think it's a good future for people in this industry. Environmental trends. Again, it's frightening to read about, the type of future we might be headed towards. And any one of us who have kids or grandkids or nieces or nephews or sisters or brothers, we're all very, very impacted by those prospects. And I just feel like quality engineers and people who work in quality assurance are sort of like a little bit an unsung hero in that scenario, because doing QA, and especially if you're like ensuring quality all across, from A through C in the whole end-to-end product cycle, you have an enormous impact on reducing waste. You can, and that's whether you work, with physical products so that you reduce physical waste products, but also if you work in software. So let's say you work in software and you're ensuring that the software is working correctly, you can, reduce the tax on data centers, which are now today, they're becoming quickly now, the big bad wolf. And especially as we're using more like AI, if we're not able to find alternative energy or ways to cool these centers down without using a lot of fresh water, those are some conflicts and dilemmas, and that's an opportunity to for quality engineers to really show themselves. Yeah, and so satisfies the users, are someone who don't need to ship something back to Amazon. Like I ordered something on Amazon last month. I had to ship it back 3 times because small little parts that hadn't been manufactured correctly. It was really that simple. And I thought about like all the packaging, all the all the fuel that it takes for it to be shipped off here and there, and like it seemed so unnecessary. Economic trends, as we're moving into service as a business, I think that quality companies, people who are kind of niching out different service sectors to really specialize in certain types of quality operations, will have a pretty good future, because, I think we're going away from this like, okay, so here's your software team, and here's your sales team, and here's your marketing team. And then you have like, that guy who does quality in the back office. We're moving away from that. We're becoming professionalized, and we're moving into more sort of like digital engineering. We're moving more into UX, UI, where, because again, user satisfaction is deeply connected with quality. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here as well. And I mentioned this about personalized customer journeys. There's tons of opportunities there for QA engineers, and developing that competitive advantage and a domain expertise, regardless of what it is that you are doing. And I think that's key. I think that as we're going through these enormous technological disruptions that we are at the moment, we don't know, like as much as 70% of the jobs that are going to be filled in the future, we might not even know what they are, but or job functions and projects, but we might be part of the teams that are carving this out, because it's going to look different. That's all we know. What we do know is that we need people to account for the quality every step of the way. Political trends. Again, I want to go back to the big disruptor, the big elephant, or the big trillion parameter elephant in the room, which again is AI. What does that mean? It can help cybersecurity. It could greatly compromise it, because as we're getting these systems that in the past you thought you had like a great password and you thought you were protected. Well, guess what? These systems are going to beat you so quickly. So we're going to have to come up with systems to improve that. Deep fakes and propaganda. These machines can go in and emulate anyone. Like just copy, pretend that this is a politician who said this and that. Imagine what effects that has on elections. Imagine what effect it has on law enforcement when people can kind of just like fake kidnappings or things like that. And so I think this is important. I know this is not directly tied to QA, but I like to look at cybersecurity and QA in kind of the same, because I feel like they're kind of twins in a way. I feel like it's the kind of functions that work on the back end to make sure that things are working correctly and that they're safe. So I think those are also trends that we really need to think about moving forward. And in conclusion, I think that we can definitely benefit from thinking about both of these two fields in parallel and see what they have of overlapping, usability. So I hope that maybe something that I talked about here today is something that you might find useful. If you are interested in learning more about Foresight and how Foresight practitioners work and how it might be something you want to use in your work, just please connect with me. I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm really excited to talk about these topics. So yeah, that's it. I'm sorry I didn't have a very long presentation, but I also wanted to keep it a little bit open for a conversation as well.
Thank you, Anne. Certainly got me thinking. I was wondering what the parallels might be between design of experiments and scenario planning. Certainly not the same, but there has to be some analogies there one could come up with. So the groups, the breakout rooms that we had earlier was not very long, and so I don't know how much, if anything, people were able to come up with. But so let's just open up the meeting right now for people to either ask questions of Anne or to present anything that you came up with within your group, your breakout room, that might have been relevant, or that both to what she's talked about, or taken us in a different direction. So John Barrett, I know you said your group was heavily into discussion. You want to tell us what you were talking about?
Well, she's already touched on it, the AI, but I do have a different question. Is standards like ISO 9000 and bunches of others. What role do you see them having to play in either establishing practices or guiding documents, or how do you see them playing out in this the future or whatever?
I will make a huge admission here right now. I am not trained in the ISO standards. I'm not. So please take that into account. The type of quality engineering I do is very different. My main customer is I work for a company called Quality Tests, and my customer is Google, and we don't interface with those standards. What I do, if I can answer more generally, and you judge if you think this is a relevant answer or not. Standards in general seem to kind of develop at a much slower pace than technology. And it develops much more slowly than technologists or people who are using technologies who have nefarious purposes. And I'm not really sure how to bridge that gap. Like in general, like now there's huge conversations in the EU and here in the US as well, how they can regulate artificial intelligence in order to prevent some of these scenarios that we can think of, which can be pretty harmful. And it's just moving at such glacial pace. And I'm also not sure that they necessarily have the right competence. And these two things are related, because obviously when things start moving quickly and evolving quickly, then also the skill sets that you need to consider the issue is going to be moving quickly as well. Did that answer your question, or was that just, I'm a way off?
No, I agree with you that standard developments, because you develop them by consensus, has to get everybody's more or less buy-in. And I'm also, have the same concern that you do, that when you're dealing with a slower moving operation, I mean, even look at what's going on in our country. A lot of the laws that apply today were passed back in the 40s and 50s, and things like that. And that's why, the Code of Federal Regulations seem to be kicking into high gear too. But to try to understand, like you're talking about with the future of quality engineering on these enlightened Gen Zers and exponentials and everybody else that's coming up behind them, is daunting to me when I pull them back and say, but we still have to meet the ISO standard. And if the ISO standard isn't necessarily prescriptive, then the application of how you control or how you set up a quality system within this arena as you're describing it, that too becomes a real challenge, because to your point, I still deal with managers who are dinosaurs. At the same time, I'm dealing with these young people that are gung-ho and they're not afraid of anything, it seems, and trying to stand in between. But one thing I have found is the more enlightened quality engineers that I'm coming across now seem to be like, I'll call it the center of the Oreo cookie. They're getting squished on both sides with, you know, the old ways of doing things and then this new futuristic way, and trying to, you know, pull it all together.
Yeah.
And so I see some invaluable tools, obviously, our communications, our the ability to influence at the C-level, talk their language, bring it down to, you know, a level that is either, you know, finance, which every C-level person seems to understand, or something along the lines that makes it a little bit easier to transition into, because basically, you know, regardless of everything that we're looking at right now, it all really will come down to the bottom line as to, you know, how much is that going to cost me? Is it going to improve quality, productivity? Am I going to do better, get worse, or stay the same, you know, et cetera? Those are just the generic type questions. And the solutions to these, you know, these young engineers that know the problem solving process and how to apply it at that higher level, I think is going to be invaluable in the future, because a lot of these folks, you know, in my experience at the C levels, simply don't understand what I'm talking about or what they're talking about. And so it's good, you know, what you're talking about here. But again, bringing it up to all the levels, I think, is going to be a real challenge.
Yeah, I think so too. And that you talked about costs. That's one thing, and it's also what we have seen, which is very common, is that we have this marshmallow test, right? Or what's called I think it's called hyperbole discount, where you tend to, in order to save a little bit of money today, you're willing to risk a much bigger problem in the future. And unfortunately, and that's because, you know, we count, you know, we do our accounting quarter to quarter and year to year, and we don't really think, we're not designed to think down the line. And to make those upfront investments. And again, one thing to say about that as well is that, well, why even make that investment if you don't even know if this is what's going to be your problem in the future? Like, you know, if things have changed 5 months from now and you did all this investment for, you know, to create these new standards, et cetera, and then guess what? You know, the landscape has shifted. So it's difficult. It really is.
What role do you see education, universities or technical schools? What role do you envision them in bringing this about?
Yeah, good question. You know, one of the things that has surprised me a little bit, and I guess again, this is something that I'm learning from this new technological paradigm that we're going into, that a lot of, I don't know if you guys have heard of no code and low code. It's this idea that when our systems become smarter and smarter, I'm talking about more and more technologically adept, I guess, or more and more capable of understanding human intent, humans don't necessarily have to skill up as much technologically, which is a good thing and a bad thing. Like, it's a bad thing because there's a lot of people with, you know, great smart people with great coding skills, and the typical people who go into engineering and go into quality engineering. Now, those skill sets might not be, on the one hand, yes, it's definitely what we need, because they are the people who are going to keep us safe in the future and ensure quality standards in the future. But it might also be good to perhaps have psychological skills, sociological skills, anthropological skills, because if you can't go after the threat itself, you might have to go after what is creating this threat. And I wonder if we kind of lost a little bit of the forest for the trees, like when we look too much at technology and technological skills, and we're hiring these white hat, hackers, and okay, so they can maybe, it's this arms race between, talked about cybersecurity now, but it's this arms race between the nefarious forces and the ones that are coming to fix it. But I wonder if this is when we really have to do some kind of root cause analysis and perhaps put in more of the educational effort into not only teaching technical skills, because there's a lot of technological approaches that could have a lower learning thresholds by using AI, for example. But look for those talents that are very good at thinking 3 steps ahead and understanding psychological motivations and understanding kind of almost like investigators, like, we might need some more of that. I don't know. Does that make sense? I certainly don't have the answer, but I really think that we need to think more multidisciplinary in the schools.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I'll let somebody else ask a question. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, John, the problem with standards is similar to the problems with ASQ certifications. The way they develop the body of knowledge is surveying people who are in quality and finding out what they're doing. So until a lot of people are doing the same thing, it'll never make it into the body of knowledge. So the certifications are always sort of behind the curve a little bit. Who else has a question or a comment for Anne? So everyone is comfortable with where you think the world is going. Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, so in our group, we talked about, we think the trend is that quality personnel will have to be broader. We see a lot of the organization, and we see, across functional silos. So would you see in the future the need for, quality engineers to kind of be more diverse and have a wide range of skills, maybe even in other, functional areas to kind of, fill in some of these gaps?
Yeah, I think so. We're way past the conveyor belts on a lot of things. And I don't know, it kind of reminds, because I think I'm a little bit more embedded in user experience research, and because I come from the social sciences, and I see the connection here. These are like twins to me, because you can test for losses, you can test for mechanical errors, and regardless, that's going to be a bad user experience. But you can also have a bad user experience that is not caused by like a technological glitch or anything like that. But is that quality engineering? Like, do these kind of fields need to talk more together? And can we use data analytics to figure this out? Can we kind of use some kind of metrics that looks at the functionality of a product and user satisfaction on the other? And so I think like there's some definitely some crossover there. And I think it also goes back to this new demand for transparency. I don't know exactly how you would do quality assurance like back in the, let's say, the 70s and the 80s, but my thinking, and maybe this is very stereotypical, but I think of like these conveyor belts. And then, you find a piece that is like, oh, no, that doesn't work. Let's throw that out, and it's very mechanical, and it's very prescriptive, and it's very sort of like single variable type of approach. Now, there's so much more. There's like, first of all, we have different types of manufacturing. You have just-in-time type of manufacturing where, this is sourced from here, this is sourced from there. And guess what? Now it's sourced from somewhere else. And then now this is kind of manufactured in a 3D printer machine or whatever. And so it becomes a lot more dynamic, and there's a lot more sort of touch points where things can go wrong, for one thing. And there's also this demand for transparency throughout the whole chain, like throughout, the full transparency is wanted. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but I think that we can expect more of it.
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Someone else? Questions for Anne? Yeah, and I think you are an anthropologist, but it has to be a little different looking at the world as it's changing rather than how a culture has been built up over time, and instead looking out ahead.
I tend to think of foresight, like the field that I come from, as a part of anthropology. I tend to think of it as studying how people are living in the future, like as opposed to today and in the past. It's kind of like studying new cultures, new life forms, new ways of interacting with each other, which again, has that social component and that cultural component. And I think we need to think more like that, because, and that's another thing, to really fully anticipate what quality is going to look like. We don't know what quality is going to look like in the future. We don't know what the expectations are going to be. We don't know how we're going to implement it, because technology changes so quickly. But so, yeah, I think there's like having that kind of understanding about what comes next. And it doesn't sound like the ISO standards are there yet. And maybe if there was a way to kind of bring them up to that, or maybe come with a completely new set of standards that can kind of define what quality looks like. So, yeah.
So what's the role of evolution in your studies? I mean, it's one thing to think back and another to look ahead, but how do we sort of meld the two together and think about, okay, this is the likely evolution, or maybe that's what you're doing with Foresight, I guess.
Yeah, it's actually the interesting part of Foresight that I didn't get to touch on now, it is actually there's a study of social change. And so you can see it as like an evolutionary path where like there's these little pieces and, a little, obviously not a genetic component, but like a mimetic component that thrives, and then it gets fused into here and then here. And so that is one approach. There's even like futurists who are exploring things like chaos theory and fractal theory when you think about how, the future evolves. For a while, I have a tendency to think of progression as cyclical, and it sounds a little wooey when you talk about it, but there's you heard this saying that history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And things from the past show up in new ways. So like we're meeting the same problems and dilemmas. They just wear different outfits. And I kind of feel like there's something there, that we have a way of preparing ourselves for the future to an extent that we know that, all right, this is going to come back. This happened, 80 years ago, it happened. It's going to happen again, but in a different way. We're talking about, technological revolutions and paradigms that, typically happen in like 50-year cycles. You have the business cycles that are much shorter. You have like this, economic upturns and downturns. So I think this is also a way to prepare, because we've been here before. They say you can't, you have to study history not to repeat the same mistakes. I think this is why we tend to repeat the same mistakes, is because we don't study history well enough. But so that is one approach, but yeah, there's also that evolutionary component as well, that again, nothing's going to be exactly like it was, but you're going to find these configurations with ideas and memes that will move forward.